Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free, where we talk to people who have lived self-actualized lives on their own terms and find out how they got there, what they do, how we can get there, what we can learn from them, how to live our best lives, find our own definition of success, and most importantly, find joy. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy, founder of New Trails Learning Systems and LongRideHome.com. You can find details of all our programs and shows on rupertisaacson.com. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. Today I've got J.D. Barker. He is a bestselling author. He writes thrillers, suspense, with a twist of the supernatural. He has had endorsements from no less than Stephen King and such like royalty. He's also autistic. In terms of living a self-actualized life, from where he began in his American childhood to where he is now, as many people know who listen to this podcast, autism, A-U-T-I-S-M, auto, Greek word for the self, this can often mean difficulty with a relationship with the exterior world, let's say. So it's intriguing to me that we're talking today with a storyteller, a communicator, with a condition that is often perceived as not being massively conducive to storytelling and communication. Yet here he is, and he's doing extremely well at it. His books are available on Amazon. If you type him in, you're going to see a plethora of them with excellent reviews. If you're a thriller reader, you're going to want to read him just for the sake of his books. But let's dive into the world of J.D. Barker. J.D., thanks so much for coming on. Please give us a little bit of an idea about who you are and how you got to where you are.
Well, thanks for having me. I honestly, that's the first time I've ever heard that the Greek root of the word. All of a sudden, it makes sense. I've never actually thought about it before. Yeah, so I'm one of those. I was born in the '70s, so back then they didn't diagnose this sort of thing. You were just kind of the weird kid they pushed off into the corner. You're kind of shunned by your peers, by adults, I went through life that way. I had no idea. I wouldn't say something was wrong with me. I knew I was different. I was reading by a very early age. I was reading when I was around 3 years old. By the time I got into kindergarten, I had read like all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries and moved on to Charles Dickens and a bunch of the classics. Always very good in school, always terrible when it came to social situations. I couldn't relate to other people. And at first I thought it was just because I was doing things that the other kids weren't. I was reading at a young age. Other kids weren't doing that yet. I didn't really relate to them. I actually related to adults, I think, a lot better than I did with kids. But I went through school. I just kind of fumbled my way through it, got into college, ended up getting a couple of different degrees. I got one in business, another one in finance. I got an IT degree. I got halfway through a psychology degree and found myself working in the corporate world. The last real job I had, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds. It's very similar to being like internal affairs at a police department. You have to monitor all the activity taking place at a brokerage firm, make sure that nobody is breaking any rules or regulations. Compare every transaction against a bunch of documented rules, and basically look for any kind of anomaly. So problem solving. So I was very good at that. I ended up writing computer software to process a lot of it, to deal with a lot of it. I did a great job with that portion of my job. But when I actually found a problem, I had to leave my office and I had to go to talk to other people. And that's where the real problems kind of came into play. Because I would have to basically go to somebody and tell them, hey, you made a mistake and here's why, which automatically put them on the defensive. And then I had to try and communicate the issue with them and try and come to a resolution. After a while,
Perfect for someone on the autism spectrum.
Yeah. So there were a lot of clashes. But my boss, to his credit, he was smart enough to recognize I was very good at, a portion of my job, not good with the people skills. He thought I had anger issues because, everybody tries to put this into some type of, explanation, put it in a box. So he sent me to an anger management class. And I sat down with a therapist for the initial interview. And we got about 20 minutes in and she stopped me and she said, have you ever been tested for autism? And I actually had no idea what that really was other than
How old were you at this point?
I was 22.
Okay.
So it was a while ago, early 90s. So she started to explain that, well, as we've been talking, I've noticed you don't make any eye contact. You tend to, stare at this one particular spot on my wall whenever you're speaking. You rub your thumb and your index finger together whenever you think. And she just started rattling off these things that I've done my entire life and never really thought twice about. And then she mentioned autism, and she spent her daytime working with autistic children, which is why these things jumped
Were
out
you
at her.
shocked? Were you
Um,
insulted? Or did you think, ah,
at first I was taken aback because I didn't know what it was, and like I said, the only exposure I ever had to it was Rain Man, that movie with Tom Cruise, which is not a very good depiction. It's
no,
nothing like the real thing. But she asked if I'd be open to getting tested, and I did, and then ultimately we landed on a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which in today's world you're just on the spectrum somewhere, but back in the day they had a name for it. And from my standpoint, it gave me a problem with a name on it that I could actually solve. So at that point, I started researching everything I possibly could. I read books, I saw movies, documentaries, any piece of information I could get on it, and basically started trying to tackle this thing. And essentially, we created a list of things that, things that I felt were problems in my life, like the social situations, social skills. But we also made another list of the things that I was able to do that other people couldn't, which, in today's world, and I doubled down on a lot of those because I was able to do a lot of things that, somebody that's quote unquote normal wasn't able to accomplish. So I spent the last 30 years, basically trying to dig out of that hole. A lot of these things I was able to correct or fix. She taught me how to make eye contact in a conversation. The funny thing is though, when I make eye contact, I can't pay attention because I'm literally telling myself in my head, keep eye contact, keep eye
mm,
contact, keep eye contact. It feels weird to me. It feels awkward. I don't want to do it. So I force myself to do it. And oddly, like my wife knows, we've been married for over 10 years now. She knows that if I don't look her in the eye, that I'm actually paying attention. And so like she's picked up on that. She picked up on that very early on. But, I basically started to work through as many of these things as I could. I mean, the social thing, that's never gone away. I don't think it ever will. But I've learned to mimic my way through social situations.
mhm.
And oddly, like that kind of tied back to the writing career. Because initially I was working on projects. I was working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, basically working with other people. And I would mimic other authors,
How did you
so if
get
I'm
into
gonna
that? And that's a big jump from being a corporate guy, telling people
well,
that they're
it
messing up.
it come it comes back
There's a
yeah.
jump there in the story.
Yeah, no, it comes back to me reading at such an early age. Books were basically my safe place. When I wanted to get away from the real world, I'd open up the cover of a book. And it just evolved, from reading other people's stories to wanting to create my own.
Mm.
I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me. So I used to write stories up. I would staple them together and I created a little library in my room and she would check those stories out. I'd charge her late fees. Like this went way back to, probably 5, 6, 7 years old. That's basically where it started. But I had been told at an early age, you can't make a living as a writer. It's too difficult a profession. You have to get a real job, which is how I ended up in the corporate world. But I would
I
come
see.
home at night during all that time, and I would write. Like that was how I
You
stayed
always
sane.
actually wanted to be a writer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've always done it. So I did that for about 20 some years. Basically the two different jobs. And over that time, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I had written, but they all came out with other people's names on the covers because they were ghost written. That gets old after a while, somebody else basically taking
But it
credit for your
teaches you
work.
the craft.
It did, and I wrote a lot of memoirs, and I think that's what really did it for me because I had to get into the head of another person. I had to
Mhm,
speak in their voice and tell a story from, somebody else's perspective. And I think
mhm.
that's what really taught me how to create characters and be able to, dig into fiction at the level that I did. Ultimately, when that 6th book hit, my wife pulled me aside. She said, listen, I know you hate your day job because I hated the corporate thing, but I was kind of trapped. I had a big salary. We had a big house. We had cars. We had a boat. We couldn't just walk away from it because it was expensive. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, which is a steel town in the middle of the US. Bought a duplex, rented out one side to some tenants. We lived in the other side, got our expenses down to next to nothing. And we lived off of savings long enough for me to write a book on my own and get it out there. And luckily, everything took off. The first book sold really well. The second one sold even better. Some TV shows and movies came along. And I've been on that roller coaster ever since.
Okay. So people will obviously want to know, what were those books you helped ghostwrite that got onto the New York Times bestsellers, and what were these books that you then got not just became your own bestsellers, but TV and film and so on. But just before we go into that, let me just backtrack with you as a child. You say books were your safe place. Did you feel unsafe in the world?
I don't know that it was unsafe. I didn't, in the 70s, like we didn't even think that way. Like cars didn't have seat belts. You
Yeah.
know, like we would jump our bike off the, off a ramp and go 20 feet across the, the road. Like we didn't think about safety back then. It just, like I would feel like certain situations, I just didn't understand them. Like kids would be playing, I would try to fit in. It always felt like I was imitating those actions, which wasn't fun. And I would see these other kids who looked like they actually were having legitimate fun. And I didn't understand why it was fun for them and not fun for me. And at a young age, that gets very frustrating. And at some point I would break off and I would grab a book and,
Right.
that would calm me back down.
So it wasn't so much about being bullied or picked on or singled out. It was more just feeling, why can't I fit in?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff was happening too, but, again, in the '70s, everybody did it. Like
Yeah.
I picked on other kids, they picked on other kids, we'd lock each other in lockers. Like it was a very different time than it is today.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I remember it. Um, okay. So, in some ways, I'm quite similar. I also used to use books as a safe place when I was at school. Why for you? You said you read the Nancy Drew and those mysteries very, very early, like at 3. Why mysteries?
I think it was really just because that's what was on at hand. And my mom owned an antique store, and we used to go to a lot of garage sales or yard sales, and she would literally pick up books by the box, like $2 for, 50 books just stuffed in a box. And initially, I think one of those boxes had a mix of those Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews in there.
Okay.
So I really fell in love with it. Mysteries, like I love the puzzle aspect of it. So I think that might have been part of it. But in general, like, in today's world, I read across the board. I'll read a romance novel, I'll read sci-fi, westerns. I don't really care what the story is about as long as it's a good story.
And then you said you got into the classics at how old?
That was when I got into kindergarten, so 5, 6 years old.
You were reading Dickens, Victorian English at 5 or 6 years old.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, Great Expectations is still my favorite book to the point where I actually wrote a retelling of it a few years back called She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be.
Interesting.
And it's my wife's favorite book, and I travel all over the world at this point, and it's the one book people put in front of me and tell me it's their favorite everywhere I go.
How interesting. Why do you think that Victorian classics got you at that age? And how did you deal with the fact that that English was so far from American vernacular English that you'd have had around you? Did you instinctively understood it, or you actually had to have someone help you with it?
No, I got through it pretty well. I think, because I always saw books as being in another place, almost like this magical realm that I could kind of go into. So
Mm,
the fact that English was different, to me it just kind of fit. It was no different than finding a dragon in a story or a warlock or something else. It's just a different way of talking. I probably didn't understand that in some part of the world people actually spoke that way. Not at that age, but in the
right.
books it made sense. I do remember that when I picked up Great Expectations the first time, we were at the library and they had a section of the classics, and all the books basically had the same kind of cover. So they looked like they belonged together like a big set. And that's what initially attracted me to them because, like I had gone through the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews. They all had a similar cover. So it all felt like, this one big project, that I had tackled, and seeing another possible project in all of those, the classics laid out like that. I think that's what initially attracted me to it. But Dickens in general, like his writing is just fantastic.
His writing is
And
fantastic. I'm just thinking
and
back now myself to Dickens, but there are what intrigues me is that the language, it's not just the use of the language, there's also vocabulary stuff. So, for example, if someone is drinking sack or drinking hot or something like that, would you have then gone and figured out what's sack? What are they drinking? What do they mean they're drinking hock?
no,
Or
most of the times when I ran into something like that, I just kept reading through it, because
okay.
it was no different than somebody making up a word, like when I read, I don't know, like Dune when I got older, like there's a lot of made up words in fantasy novels and things like
Mhm.
that. So like I think my brain just kind of tied that all together as just this was just some made up word. Like I didn't know that it was actually a real thing.
Okay. Okay. Right. The big picture rather than the details, effectively.
Yeah.
But what is intriguing to me is that it's to some degree a little bit like learning another language, and your young brain at that time, obviously being very plastic, would have been firing many, many neurons, I'm thinking, dealing with these other worlds that, as you say, you weren't aware were actual worlds at that point. So, okay, so then you get into your early stages of mysteries. And of course, a lot of Dickens, they are actually mysteries, most of them. There's usually, a big puzzle that has to be deciphered. And if you boil Dickens down, it's usually a bit of a suspense novel with a romantic twist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then you get into helping people to ghost write and write memoirs. How does that happen?
Well, I was in college. One of my first jobs, I worked for BMG Distribution, which was a division of RCA Records. I was essentially a glorified babysitter. So they'd have a recording artist come into South Florida. I'd have to pick them up at the airport, get them to the radio station for interviews, get them to their concert, get them to their hotel, and get them back on an airplane when it was time for them to leave town. And this was some very famous people. So to really date myself, we had people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the Block, Madonna, a bunch of hair bands, Poison, Motley Crue, Bon Jovi. Yeah, so I realized very quickly I was running up a lot of debt. Going to school is expensive. And I had some very famous people in a car with me, sometimes for a week at a time. So I would interview them. And then I would take those interviews and I would sell them to a lot of the magazines that were around back then, like 17 and Teen People and Tiger
Oh,
Beat.
clever.
And when you work with anybody in newspapers and magazines, you quickly learn that they've got a novel that they've been working on for the last 10 years. It's in a desk drawer somewhere. They're almost done. It's 400,000 words. It just needs a little something. I was very good with grammar and punctuation and just kind of the rules of writing. So those people initially would give me those books to kind of go through them and clean it up. Then I started offering developmental suggestions, like the story takes off here. This part should come out. I think your character development needs a little work here. And that basically turned into the side hustle as working as a ghostwriter or a book doctor, basically helping those people tweak their novels and get them to the point where they were ready for publication. Over time, word of that spread. Agents would call me, their editors would call me. They'd acquire a book that they absolutely loved, but they couldn't get it published because it needed work and they couldn't get the original author to do it because they were just too new. And, if you go to a debut author and you say, you've got to take 40,000 words out of this book, it's a difficult thing, but they would
Yeah.
bring me in as a hired gun. I had no skin in the game. So, I would just take their direction and they didn't sugarcoat anything with me. And it's funny because in today's world, I'm a published author. If I get a phone call from my editor, if they've got a problem with a book, they'll usually tell me 2 or 3 things they absolutely love about the book. Then they'll tell me that one thing that they need me to fix. And then they'll finish up that phone call with 1 or 2 more things they love about the book. They kind of sandwich it in between, the bad news between a bunch of good news. But when
Yeah.
you're a hired gun, they didn't do any of that. They would just tell me everything they hated about the book, tell me what needed to be fixed. And I think I learned a lot about the writing industry through those conversations and what the folks in New York were really looking for.
Absolutely. I think that if anyone who's listening is wanting to write and publish a book, the 2 things to know are the most important thing about a book is its structure. The structure's got to be so good that it's invisible, and that's what keeps you going. And the other thing is the editing. And really, the editors should be on the spine of the book alongside the author, because I'm a great believer that any book that I've read that's worth reading, it's largely down to the editors. But it sounds like you got a crash course in editing, effectively.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. But books are made in the editing process, not necessarily in the writing process.
I agree. Okay, so give a couple of ideas of some of the memoirs that hit big and other books that hit big that you helped to ghostwrite, and then let's go into your own work.
I wish I could talk about that, but that whole industry, like there are NDAs for
NDAs.
everything. Yeah, I mean, in today's world, I write books with James Patterson. Like he's constantly bugging me, about those titles. He wants to know who I worked with in the past, and I can't even tell him. They're, I wish I could. But it's just it's one
Okay,
of those
that
things.
reminds
Yeah.
me of a very good story. Do you know who the famous actor, not Christopher Plummer, gosh, Saruman in Lord of the Rings, gosh, you know who I'm talking about? And he was in so many horror movies, and let me just find him quickly because it's a great story along those lines. It's Christopher Lee, and Christopher Lee
Right.
had been a special ops intelligence dude during World War II, and he was always being pestered by journalists about this. And he has a famous story of one person who just wouldn't let go and wouldn't let go and wouldn't let go. And so he finally said, "Can you keep a secret?" to this guy. And he goes, "Yes." He goes, "So can I." And that was the end of the interview. So no, I get it. Okay, so but nonetheless, you were brought in. You have to sign the NDAs. You can't talk about them, but you learn the craft. Then you float your first book. Tell us about that book.
Yeah, so at that point, when I sat down to write it, it was called Forsaken. I knew I wanted to write a horror novel because that was always my favorite genre to play around in. And at that point, I felt like I knew, how to craft a good book, beginning, middle, and end. It's funny because you could take any one of my books and drop them into a 3-act structure. They all fit, but I've never had any formal training. Like my formal training comes from all the reading that I've done in the past.
Right.
That structure is basically ingrained in my head. Like I know when I take a wrong turn while I'm writing, I know a
Mm,
twist needs to happen here, a climax needs to start here. Like it all
mm.
just feels organic to me. So I sat down, I wrote Forsaken. In the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. And just to get the book finished, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, which is the store from Stephen King's novel. Fully expecting to have to change that, but it was just something I did to get the book down on paper. My wife read it and she said, you know what, before we change that, why don't we see if we can get King's permission to use it? And ultimately I was able to do that. And that's what launched my career, the fact
That's
that he
not
was
an
willing to
easy
take
thing
that
to do.
chance
How
on
did
me.
you contact Stephen King to get that permission?
The story behind it is, I think, what actually launched the book. So it turns out he's got a house in Florida that's about 10 minutes from where my mother lives. So we were down there visiting. We printed out the book. We hopped in the car and figured, well, we'll head over to Stephen King's house. He'll be outside gardening or something. I'll hand him the manuscript. He'll give us a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way. It didn't work out that way. So
I'm very
King lives
surprised.
on, yeah, he lives on a little island right off the coast of Florida. We call him Keys down there. He lives
Yeah.
on Casey Key. You go over this tiny little bridge. If you make a left, you go to the entire portion of the island where bars and restaurants and stuff like that are. If you make a right, you kind of go to the half that King owns, and there's immediately a private drive sign, a no trespassing sign. We got about a half mile in, and there was a gate, and then there was another gate. I started looking up in the trees, thinking there's going to be a sniper coming at us next, and this is probably a bad idea. So my wife and I, we turned around. We went to a little restaurant down near the bridge. I called a friend of mine. His name was Dallas Mayer. He wrote the name Jack Ketchum. He passed away a few years ago, but a really nice guy. I knew he was friends with King, and I told him what we were up to, and he said, "Oh yeah, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Send him the book. If he likes it, you'll hear back from him. If the book is shit, he probably won't reply, but leave him alone." So I emailed off the book with a couple little paragraphs explaining what I was up to. I didn't expect to hear from anybody, and then about a day or two later, I got an email back from King, and he said, "I love this. Go ahead and use it. Let me know if you need anything." And, ultimately the book came out. I indie published that very first one. Sales were okay at the start, but nothing spectacular. I hired a friend of mine to do PR, somebody I had worked with back in the music business years earlier. And I told her about this failed trip to Stephen King's house. And she said, you know what? That's the story. So she reached out to a bunch of publications, and ultimately Publishers Weekly wrote a story about this new author trying to get to Stephen King's house to get his permission for use in a book. And that story came out, and librarians read it, bookstore owners read it, and all of a sudden they started ordering the books, and that's where sales really took off.
What's interesting to me about that is that he had the time and the bandwidth to read that book because, I mean, I'm sure people send you manuscripts. Do you have the time to read them? Maybe.
No, and the thing, like, I probably get, I know he gets over 100 books a month because I've
Indeed.
gotten to know him a little bit, and he doesn't read hardly any of them.
So what
At the
made
time,
him yours?
I didn't realize how rare of a thing it was. Being autistic, it's one of my superpowers. The way my wife describes it is, I don't take no for an answer. I don't really see, the possibility of failure. Like I personally, I feel like I would rather ask the question
Well,
and
for
have somebody
sure.
turn me down than not ask the question at all. So I
Indeed.
just
But
always approach
why do
things
you
that
think
way.
he picked yours out of that 100 in the month?
If I had to guess, just because it came in, through that email address, which probably nobody
Ah,
has, and I was recommended to him by a mutual friend.
God.
So it was but I mean, into like, he's just an all around very, very nice guy. So I send him every book that I put out. And I had one a few years back called A Caller's Game, and I shipped it to him from Amazon. And I got a phone call from the Amazon driver when he was delivering, and he said, "Listen, it's pouring rain out here. I left the book at your gate. Can you come out and get it?" And not, this wasn't my house; it's Stephen King's house. So I emailed King. And I told him that Amazon left this book outside. He got his umbrella out, got his raincoat out, went out there in this nasty weather just to get that book, from his gate and bring it back into his house. Like a lesser guy would have probably just let it out, left it out there to rot. But like that's
Yeah.
just the kind of guy that he is.
Interesting.
He remembers what it was like. He wrote, when he wrote Carrie, he wrote that in a trailer, between a washer and dryer. Like he came
Right.
from nothing. And he knows what that's like. And, that struggle is very real, I think, for all of us authors.
Absolutely. The other thing that surprises me is that, of course, he might have decided, sure, you can use it. But as you know, authors don't necessarily own their books. So if someone was to ask me if they could use something from my book, I'd have to check with my publishers because effectively they own that book, not me. So why didn't his publishers kick up a fuss and say, no, this JD Barker guy, he's got to pay, $20K to use that, blah, blah, blah.
King has been in this industry for a very long time, and he knows the business inside and out. I'm sure he looks very closely at every one of his contracts. He
Mm.
knows what he can do and what he can't do.
Mhm.
But I totally understand what you're saying. Like I've got a fantastic agent who is very good at spotting those things. Usually, removes that kind of stuff, from a contract. But I've got film and TV deals in place now where certain characters are owned by a studio.
Yeah,
So I can't use my own characters in some situations
absolutely.
without getting a studio to sign off on it.
Ab
The funny thing is, the Forsaken, like it's the only book that I've written so far that hasn't been optioned at some point for a movie. And usually the turning point is because they find out about King's involvement because, they love the story. They're ready to make it. It's, a nice, quick little cheap horror movie that they could film. But then they hear that it's tied to Needful Things and the lawyers get a hold of that. And they're like, yeah, but Needful Things is optioned by so and so. That means we have to get permission from these people. These
Absolutely.
people have to sign off on it. It gets so muddy that everybody just kind of walks away slowly and doesn't do anything.
Exactly, yeah, I mean, Hollywood hates a lawsuit.
Yep.
I have, in the Horse Boy, which is the main book that people know me for, I used a very, very small excerpt from a Dr. Seuss book, because that's what I used to read to my autistic son, and boy, oh boy, the hoops I had to jump through just to get, this tiny little thing, and it cost me quite a lot of money too, but it was worth it because
Uh,
obviously it was
I
part of the
I
story.
I
But no, I'm
I
I'm
went
aware
through
of this,
that
and of
with
course, yeah, once you get into. Go ahead.
I went through the same thing with Frosty the Snowman. So I've got a book I wrote called The Fifth to Die, and in it they find a body inside of a snowman. And I just wanted to use a couple lyrics from that song. And I don't know if the rules are different where you are, but in the US it's based on a percentage. Like the words are basically a percentage of the actual song that you're allowed to use without permission. Anything over that particular number, you have to get permission. But Frosty the Snowman has so many repetitive lines in it, you can't really get away with a whole lot. So yeah, we had to chop it down and just use little pieces, but it's one of those songs where you can, tick off 2 words and everybody knows the rest. I think
Exactly,
you can get
luckily.
away with it. Yeah.
Okay, so of the books, give us a sort of chronology of the books that you've written. Um, what they are and where they've gone, like which ones have gone to TV, which ones have gone to film, which ones have been optioned but they haven't been made. Just give us a bit of a geography of your work.
Yeah, so the first one was Forsaken, we've already talked about that. While that was coming out, I wrote a serial killer series called The Fourth Monkey, 3 different books based on a serial killer in Chicago. That one, when the publication rights sold, we also sold it for a feature film and for a follow-up TV series, with CBS. While that was going on, I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family. That one was picked up by Paramount with Andy Machete attached to direct. I think the next one that I wrote after that was A Caller's Game, which was picked up by Ridley Scott's company. Um, She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be, the Charles Dickens retelling. That one was done. It's currently in development as a TV show. Um, there's so many. I'm trying to get it's funny. I think I've got
So
12
did,
books
did
out there at
those
this point.
did those early ones get made?
No, that's the thing. Like in Hollywood, like everything has been optioned, some of them over and over again. Nothing has actually been filmed yet. At this point, it's kind of a numbers game. Like I've got so many in the works, something is bound to happen, but like it is completely out of my control. One of the things that I've learned is when something gets optioned, usually they go in for a year, they go in for like 18 months, maybe 2 years at the onset. But as soon as that option expires, the folks in Hollywood know that it's a known commodity. So they tend to jump all over it and somebody else usually scoops up that option right away. So
Yeah.
things haven't been out of option. But things can get really crazy. A friend of mine told me once, if you watch the credits at the end of a movie, all those names flying by, it takes 5 or 6 minutes to get through all of them. Every
Mm.
one of those people had to come together and be there in order for that movie to make it to the screen. And, it's like this perfect storm that has to happen.
Oh,
To
so
give
I so hear you.
Yeah, so, like, stuff can fall apart. I mean, to give you an example, a Caller's Game with Ridley Scott's company, at one point, I got a phone call saying Jennifer Garner had signed on. She loves the book, she wants to make it. Jennifer Garner had what's called a first look deal with Netflix. So now we had a studio. Netflix greenlit a $100 million budget for the project. All this stuff happened probably within about 2 to 3 weeks. Then we got another phone call. Jennifer Garner's got a scheduling conflict. She's got to pull out. So our star went away, then Netflix went away, and the budget went away.
Yeah,
All of this stuff, within a month. It's like this crazy roller coaster. So honestly, like
absolutely.
I keep my head down and just kind of write the next book. I know sooner or later it's going to happen, but I try not to get too wrapped up in all that
Well,
stuff.
one of the things which I found with this, because I've had a couple of books optioned and then they stayed in option for, gosh, a decade, and then one and yes, all sorts of actors were attached. It's exactly as you describe it. It all goes very quiet, and then you get a phone call saying, yeah, this big person, or it's a person you've never heard of that they tell you is big. particularly as you get older like me and you sort of don't know who the celebs are anymore. And then it goes away for this. So that actress goes and has a baby, or it turns out that, as you say, scheduling conflict or whatever. But what I've found is sometimes I don't wait around. Sometimes I just go and make them myself. And so I made a documentary. I made 2 TV reality shows that way called The Quest. Have you not considered just being a producer and making one of them yourself for the crack?
At some point I might, but like I know how to write a good book. I know a good book is going to bring me, a nice payday. I do really well with them. So like I just don't have the bandwidth to branch out to do other things like that. Like that would just take there's once we figure out how to get 27 or 30 hours in a day, then I could probably take something like that on. But right now it's just not happening.
And is all your publishing self-publishing, or are you with several different mainstreams?
I've been all over the place. So the serial killer series I mentioned, that was with HMH, which is now part of HarperCollins.
Mhm.
I've got books with Random House. I indie published my first book, and then I kind of did a hybrid approach for a couple of books because when you indie publish, the economics are fantastic. You make about 70 cents on the dollar. Traditional publishers are good because they give you a nice big advance check, but you've got to pay that advance back. And
Yeah.
usually it's for pennies on the dollar. So you've got to sell a lot more books to pay that money back than if you were to indie publish it. So after I got about 4 or 5 books in, I started
Yeah, you
becoming
do.
very aware of that. And I wanted to try and take some of the control back. So I did a hybrid approach. I basically told my agent, I'm going to retain English rights for myself. So the various countries that speak English, I'm going to put those out. And she's more than welcome to continue selling in all the foreign territories for each of my books. And I'm in about 150 different countries, a little shy of 30 languages. So I've got, it's a pretty decent, pool she's still got to play in. But I did that for a couple of books and I really liked it. Then about a year and a half ago, I wrote a book called Behind a Closed Door, and I sent it off to my agent. And at that point, I was with a company called Writer's House. They started shopping it. While they were shopping it, we started getting phone calls from the folks in Hollywood. We ended up selling the film option before we sold anything on the publication rights. The publishers got wind of that. So then all the publishers all of a sudden wanted this book because it's been optioned. So the book was about to go to auction, meaning there were more than one publishers that wanted to get involved. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at Random House, and she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book in this auction. And when that happens, you need to turn it down. And I asked her why. And she said, well, we're about to lay off a bunch of people. And the editor who wants your book is on that list. And there's nothing worse than having a book, that loses its editor at a publisher because that book can sit there in limbo forever. I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins about a week later. And then all these layoffs happened all across the industry, which really spooked me. So I reached out to some friends of mine that I used to work with in finance. Simon & Schuster had just recently been bought by a private equity firm. So I started these back channel conversations with Simon & Schuster. And ultimately, I created my own imprint through Simon & Schuster. We struck a deal where I basically created my own publishing imprint through Simon & Schuster. They handle all of my print sales and distribution. So I kind of get the best of both worlds. I can put out whatever books I want, whenever I want, but through Simon & Schuster, which means they get in all the places I couldn't get to as an indie author. So you'll find my books in the big box stores. You'll find them in the grocery stores, the drugstores, any place where books are sold. So that's where I'm at today, and I honestly love it. I think it's the best possible position I could be in.
I agree. Now, of course, wading through the fine print of all those contracts is a difficult thing. Does your agent still handle all that, even when you're semi-indie?
It depends on the contract, and I've got multiple agents. I've got one that handles domestic sales, another one that handles foreign. I've got a film and television agent, and I've got an attorney who kind of oversees all of it. So depending on what's coming down the pike, I tend to pass it off to the right pair of eyes. I try not to review that stuff on my own.
Absolutely.
But I can. I mean, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm for 2 decades. That's all legal experience. I've been through more contracts than I could name. So I'm capable of doing it. But it's always good. Even if I was an attorney, I would still get a second pair of eyes to look at some of these things. Publishing contracts tend to be pretty straightforward, but a film and TV contract can be 300 pages long.
Yeah.
And they might say the same thing 5 different ways at different spots in the contract. It's best to have the right person look at that sort of thing.
Okay. How did you go about getting your first agent? I know, so the reason I'm asking you that question is, again, I know a lot of people really want to write. And when they have something good, whether it's a proposal, if it's nonfiction, or they've actually written the book as fiction, because again, a little bit of insider information for the listeners. If you're going to write a memoir or something like that, you can often get a publishing deal with a very good proposal. But for fiction, you almost always have to write the whole book. But once you've got that, getting an agent, of course, as you know, is not just extremely useful, it's kind of key. How did you go about getting your agent, and what advice have you got for people now? Because the industry's changed a lot since we came into it. So how did you get your first agent? And then what would you say to people who are coming to it now wanting to find a good agent?
Well, the first time around, I did it completely wrong. I had no idea what I was doing when it came like, I knew how to write a book. I had no clue how to get an agent. So I actually bought a list of 200 agents, just an Excel spreadsheet with all their contact information. And I sent out a mass email, literally to whom it may concern. Here's what my book is about. Here's the first 3 chapters. I sent to everybody the exact same thing, which is not how you're supposed to do it. If you go to an agent's website, everyone tells you exactly what they want. They're all different. This agent wants a PDF file. This one wants a Word document. This one wants 1 chapter. This one wants 3. They want it in an Arial font, but this one wants Times New Roman. Like every one of them is different. You have to appease them. You have to do what they're asking because they will just hit that delete button the second it comes in if it's not in the right format, without even looking at what the book is about. So the first time with Forsaken, I sent all those out and I didn't get an agent. I got hardly any responses because I basically did it wrong. When it came time for the second book, The Fourth Monkey, I had a really strong sales record behind me, which makes things way easier, because they were able to pull up my sales record. They could see what I was capable of moving, on my own as an indie author. That's something that's very attractive to the traditional publishers because you've got a proven track record. So I had no trouble getting an agent the second time around.
Yeah,
I
that
think
would
I
make
very,
how did you move all those copies as the indie author? I mean, I know that you had this great story about trying to get to Stephen King and then him obviously reading your book and so on. But nonetheless, to actually move copies is another thing. How did you do that?
yeah, I mean, the Stephen King helped a lot because it kind of spurred things. You have to have a good book. Like that's key. Like a lot of people think they don't even consider that, but like you have to have a 5-star read. It has to
Yeah.
be the kind of book where somebody reads it and they tell 5 people about it.
Yeah.
Because word of mouth is what really sells books. And that particular book, and luckily a lot of mine have had that kind of power. People just tell their friends about them. They read one, they've got to read the next 5 that I write. So I've been really lucky when it comes to that. I did a lot of advertising very early on, Facebook and Amazon ads before it was really popular. I did a lot of translations early on before indie authors were really doing that sort of thing. I hired my own translators and put the books out in different countries all on my own. And the margins are much better. And I took that same, that money and I was able to roll it back into more advertising and it just becomes this self-fulfilling machine.
So you were basically
Um,
using your savings to do those translations, buy those ads, because that's the other thing is people have to know that the book exists. They need to know that it's out there. What would you say
yeah.
it cost you to put that first book out?
I think I spent about $1,000 on the cover, maybe another 2,000 for formatting and editing. Probably all in, maybe $5,000 or so to get it out the door. The audiobook, I think I paid $400 per finished hour, so that was about another $4,000 or $5,000. But I made that back like within the first month easily on audiobooks.
Mhm.
They're not quite as lucrative as they used to be, but you can still. I mean, they're a huge profit center. Yeah, I think
But the
every author
Facebook
should be
ads and
doing.
that sort of thing, that's not cheap. So you're 10 grand in there.
No.
What did you spend on the advertising?
Oh, I mean, there's points in my career where I've spent 10 or $15,000 in a month. I've done that within a week of publication on one book. I spent I think $15,000 in 7 days.
Right.
It's all about for me. It's about watching the metrics. As long as the money coming in it exceeds the money going out, it's worthwhile.
But that first book, you're a first time author, you're doing a bit of a financial white knuckle ride. What would you say, okay, so we're 10 grand in for the production. What would you say it cost you in the advertising? Going back, remembering this is what, 20 years ago or 15 years?
It was about 10 years ago. I couldn't give you a number without going back to the spreadsheets. It got significant at one point, but your
But
dollars
we
went
know
a
it's
lot
not
further
cheap,
back
right?
in those days. No, I mean, like I was
Mm.
getting click throughs at like 5-10 cents back then. Like in today's world, you just don't get that. It's too crowded of a market.
Yeah.
So it's completely different. BookBub back then, like you would get one BookBub deal and you'd move 5-10,000 copies in a day. Like that just doesn't happen anymore with BookBub. I'm always looking for like the next biggest thing. From what I've been able to tell over the years, if I see all the other indie authors out there talking about it, doing something, at that point it's too late. Like it's time to find the next big thing. If you do what everybody else is doing, you're just going to kind of get lost in that mix.
And how do you go about finding that new big thing? Again, there'll be young authors out there needing this information.
Yeah, so I think the autistic person in me is what really leads that charge. I look at a problem and I look for a solution to that problem. So
Mm.
to give you an example, TikTok, when TikTok first came out, I started watching it, trying to figure out like how can an author move a book on TikTok? And I quickly realized nobody wants to see me dancing around in a bathing suit holding up my book. That's not going to work. It's
Actually,
not
I do.
scalable. it's one of those things, like, it's just not, I couldn't do it enough of that. Like, so what I ultimately ended up doing, I hired a couple college kids. They combed through Book Talk, which was the hashtag used for TikTok, and they started gathering email addresses of all the people that were pushing books on TikTok. And ultimately, I put together a list of about, I think it's 3,500 to 4,000 Book Talk influencers. The smallest one's got 1,000 followers. The biggest one has a little shy of 1 million. And we created a company called Best of Book Talk. So once a week, we put out an email that goes to those influencers. I get ARC copies from the traditional publishers for free that I can give to those influencers. So it's very similar to BookBub, but for influencers. So they get an email of 5 or 10 titles. They can say, okay, I want this one, and this one. And my company arranges the ARCs to go to them directly. So now I've got this giant tool that has this mailing list that goes out once a week. Anytime I want to push my own titles, I can put them in there and get them in front of that large group, millions and millions of followers all in one shot, essentially for free, because I'm piggybacking on a company that I already own, versus, me trying to create videos, just hoping to go viral and create something, like everybody else is doing. So that's the kind of thing that I do. I look for,
What gave you the idea to start to that's brilliant. What gave you that idea to start a company to supply these people with books?
my accountant. Because if you once you start doing anything that brings in any kind of revenue, it's best to break it off from the other revenue generating sources. So, it became an LLC, then it became a corporation. I've done that quite a few times over over my career, just creating stuff. It's like throwing spaghetti at a wall. I mean, for every 10 things that I create, one of them might actually work out. But if I don't try, like none of them are going to work out. So I'm always trying something different.
And in order to get so when you're putting the titles, I presume you still do this, in front of these book talk influencers, how do you get these titles? How can you be sure that you can deliver them? Because that's distribution effectively. How do you become that distributor?
It's all already done in advance. So while the influencers are signing up and working, on that portion of the list, getting the email and requesting books, publishers are basically bidding for those spots within the email. Just like if you're as an author, you try to get a spot on BookBub, you have to pay BookBub to be on that particular email. So every book that's listed is a bought and paid for spot from the
Okay.
traditional publishers.
Right. But I guess for me, what I'm trying to understand is you're not, are you sending them physical copies, or are you
No,
just
we pass
recommending
on.
that they read something?
No, we give them 2 options. So they can either download the ebook, which we set up the download link so they can actually download directly to their Kindle, or they can request a physical copy. And if they request a physical copy, their information goes into a form and that data gets transmitted to the publisher, and then the publisher actually mails them out. So we don't physically have to touch anything.
And how do you choose which titles to put in front of them?
We get a lot of submissions from all the publishers, so we just kind of pick through them and, pick our favorites, what we feel is going to work. Over time, we've learned what the audience on TikTok is looking for too. Like, we know they're not going to resonate with like a children's book. Westerns don't do particularly well. It's really fantasy and romance, and thrillers, come third. So yeah, we've learned that over time, and we keep that in mind as we pick the titles.
So it's mostly fantasy.
Fantasy tends to be the biggest right now. Yeah, across the board.
This sounds like a full-time job. How do you have time to write?
I hire other people to
Okay.
do. I mean, it starts off as an idea coming out of my head. Then I usually rope in, one of my assistants or one of, and somebody to help me. Then it just kind of grows from there. I mean, at this point, there's 4 different people that work on Best of Book Talk alone. They're in the middle. Like right now, if things continue, TikTok is going to get shut down here in the U.S. as of
Mm.
this coming Sunday. So they've been scrambling to try and figure out what comes next. So we've already purchased all the domains for like Best of Bookstagram and, like basically all the other platforms. The nice thing is in that particular world, an influencer, they don't just, put book reviews on TikTok. They tend to put it out on all the different social media platforms. So it's going to be a sideways step for all of them. It's just at this point, nobody knows where that sideways step is going to be.
Interesting. When you say you just hire other people, but of course that takes, there must be a point where you're prototyping an idea like that, Best of Book Talk, where you have to just do it yourself and bootstrap it and then see if it works and then hire other people, because of course that's expensive. Or do you take the risk and just hire right away?
No, it tends to grow. Like I tend to do, like 99% of the work at the very beginning. Then I bring in other people, pawn off 50% of it, just kind of whittle away at it until I get
Mhm.
into, I fall into more of a supervisory role.
How long would you say you're having to do all of it before you can hand it over to, say, 50%?
It really depends on the entity. I mean, that one took off straight away. As soon as
Mhm.
we put it out there, we got reception from the publishers, we got reception from the influencers. I knew it was gonna grow, and I knew I'd be able to scale it.
Mm.
Right now, we're trying to decide, do we wanna scale into other languages?
Mm.
Do we wanna, we're only doing 1 email a week. I mean, we could easily create 1 email for thrillers, another one for fantasy, another one for romance, put out 3 or 4 emails a week. So those are the kind of conversations we're having internally.
So with something like that, you're writing now, you're sort of influencing. The next step presumably sounds like publishing. Are you going to become a publisher?
Well, I sort of already am with my arrangement with Simon& and Schuster, so I've got that covered too.
But in terms of publishing other people and becoming a house?
I've thought about it. I'm doing a lot of work with co-authors, which I'm really enjoying. I've got a ton of ideas, but I've only got so much time to write books on my own. So every once in a while, I'll come up with an idea and I'll create it and bring in somebody else to write it with me. And I love doing that. I mean, I've got a book I just released in November called Heavy Are the Stones. I wrote it with a woman named Christine Daigle, who's a neuropsychologist in real life. So she was able to bring that mindset and that skill set into the writing process. And as an author, I can fake my way through it. I can do a bunch of Google searches, I can research, and I can kind of create a character that's a neuropsychologist, and make it seem authentic. But having somebody who really does that in real life as part of the writing process, you can't beat that. So, I'm working with a ton of co-authors just to try and to strengthen that, and it increases the number of books that I'm putting out. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
And when you work with co-authors, are you doing a work for hire thing? Are you paying them a fee and then they also get a percentage of a royalty? How does that work?
Accounting for something like this can get really complicated if you do it on a split royalty basis. So I
Mm.
just do it as a work for hire. They're basically coming in, mainly for the exposure and for the learning curve.
Mm.
I can teach them how to write a thriller, a solid thriller from start to finish. And most of the authors that I bring in, they're good, but they're not. And then the flip side, when the book comes out, it's coming out through Simon and Schuster. It's coming out worldwide. So they're basically, they've got a book with their name on it and all these places they could never get to on their own. Which means when they write their next book, it makes it that much easier because an agent's going to look them up and they're going to see they've had titles, at all these different places, all these different languages. They've got a proven track record, which makes it that much easier. So again, it's a win-win for everybody.
So you give them room on the book jacket. You say this is, JD Barker with so and so, or JD Barker
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
so and so.
Yeah. Yeah. I make it very clear that it was written with somebody else. I give everybody the credit that they have coming to them. As coming out of the world when I didn't get that credit, when my name
Mm.
wasn't even on the cover, I'm
Mm.
very cognizant of it to make sure that they get what they deserve.
And how do you find your co-writers? That's not necessarily an easy thing to find, especially good ones.
No, a lot of them, it's funny because they'll have a book coming out and their agent will send me an ARC copy or their publisher will send me one. So I pick up on people that way. I meet a lot of authors at writer conferences. A lot of authors in today's world, they know that I'm doing this, so they talk to each other. I get a lot of recommendations that way. There's never been a shortage. It's really about, picking the quality of the names that come in, the process, the people that come through my door.
Well, indeed, and that's not always a given, right? Because you
No, I
don't
mean,
necessarily know how well they write until you try.
I really think that writing is, like there's a writer's gene, like somebody can either tell a story or they can't tell a story.
Yeah, yeah.
That I think you're born with that. All the basics, the grammar rules, punctuation, all that kind of stuff, like that can be taught. But that writer gene, the storyteller gene can't be. So I really look for that. If I find somebody who I feel can tell a story, but needs some work on something else that I can fix, I'm all in. But they could have perfect grammar, perfect punctuation, their pacing might be great, but if they can't tell a story, it's like reading a textbook and, it just, that won't work.
So you're looking in general for sort of first-time authors who might be looking for a break. Would that be right? And have they already written something so that you can test whether or not they're any good?
Some have written full books. Other ones have only written short stories. Some work in the newspaper or magazine, or, they're doing something else online where they're writing, but not quite at the novel stage. So then it all kind of depends. If they've got a book out there, then obviously I've got an easy sample I can read. If they've never written fiction before, I'll give them some kind of an assignment to see what they come up with. Everyone is different. I don't think one project has come together the same way as another one.
Right. And then in terms of when you are co-authoring, it's an intriguing thing. And I think a lot of people listening to this would, see an opportunity there, because there will be among our listeners some decent writers there who maybe could see this as an opportunity. Roughly what percentage of the book would you say they write?
They write almost all of it, and that's, on purpose, not because I don't wanna do the work, but because if I write it, they're not gonna learn anything. So I hold their hand through the entire process. We come up with the title together, we come up with the tagline together, we write the back of book blurb, which is the text that you find on the back of a paperback. I make
Mhm.
them do all that straight at the get-go before we do anything related to the writing process. Like, whenever I write a book, the tagline is always on a piece of tape on my monitor. I read it every single day before I start writing. Same thing with the about the book, the back of book text. Like, I feel
Mhm.
like if you read that every day before you start writing, it's always gonna keep you on task to make sure you write the book that you're supposed to write. So I force them to create all those different parts. Once we've got those, I walk them through the outlining process. We outline the book from start to finish, and we keep going at it and going at it until it's perfect. I basically teach them what they're doing wrong. I tell them what I would change in it. We keep going back and forth on it until we get an outline that's solid, and then we start the writing process and hold their hand chapter by chapter, sentence by sentence, and walk them through everything that I've learned, working with people like James Patterson.
And then if you were to average it out, what would you say that co-authoring process takes you per book? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 6 months? What is it?
Everybody's different. I got an email this morning from one where he literally just said, "We just had our 2-year anniversary, and here's the finished draft."
Mhm.
He just went through like my last round of edits and comments and stuff, and he just cleaned it all up and got it back to me. So that one took 2 years. I've got other ones that are done in 6 months.
Like,
For me personally, I can write a book in 3 to 4 months. Everybody's different. The nice thing about this is there's no rush.
yeah.
I want it to be perfect. I want it to be right. And if it takes 5 years, if it takes 10 years, I don't care. But I'm not going to rush something through just for the sake of getting it done.
Right. But of course, economically, these people, presumably they have day jobs or side hustles or other things that they're doing. What would you say is the average rate? Like, if someone's listening to this, they think, well, maybe I'd like to have a go at that co-authoring thing, but I'm not yet, a known author. So my place in the marketplace is very much in a sort of beginner. What could somebody expect? What's the average that someone could expect to earn for a job like that? Work for hire.
Well, I don't want to get into the economics of it because it's different for everybody. I mean, I approach it based on their financial situation. From a time standpoint, I would say probably a year on the short end. Somebody who's not familiar with writing a book, if they've only got experience in nonfiction or short stories or something like that, it's probably a year and a half to 2 years from start to
Mhm.
finish.
Mhm. Right. I'm just thinking, some people might think, oh my gosh, would I be able to live for a year on that? I would imagine the answer would probably be no, right? They'd have to have other sources of income, no? Probably.
Yeah, no, I mean, the point of this isn't the money. What this really stemmed from, like, years back, I was mentoring a lot of authors. I
Mhm.
was, basically teaching them how to do this, but they paid me for that. And I felt icky about taking money for this kind of thing, but I had to
Mhm.
charge because it kind of weeded people out. I
Well,
was a
it
big
also takes
gatekeeper.
time. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so but I basically flipped the model on its head, and instead of them paying me for a mentorship situation, I pay them for the finished book. So they do walk away with something, rather than, what they were doing before.
Right. And then you said that you co-authored with James Patterson, who's obviously a huge name. How did that come about?
He read The Fourth Monkey. The publisher sent it to him hoping to get one of those blurbs, one sentence on the back,
Mhm.
and he read it and felt strongly about it and reached out and asked if I wanted to co-author with him.
Fantastic. So he also wants to get more books out there than he himself has time to do. So did he some degree mentor you through that model?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's been a huge mentor, not only on the writing front, but also the business side.
Mhm, mhm. Wonderful. And on his books, would you get your book on your name,
Yeah, we actually have
and
because
would it just be him?
in our contract, it says that my name has to be printed in an equal font size to his.
Mhm.
In America, other countries, it's different. I think you're in the UK, right? It's so like some places that rule applies, some places it doesn't.
Mm,
But he knows that I'm doing this for exposure, so he's got no problem with giving me the name recognition. And I bring a pretty big audience to every book that we co-author together too,
absolutely.
which is helpful.
And if somebody wanted to get into co-authoring, obviously there's a contract involved, I presume. Would you have your agent or your lawyer draw up that contract? Would you encourage them to get their own representative to check that contract over? Like, what would your advice be for a newbie?
Yeah, I would never sign anything, without having, the proper set of eyes look at it, so
Mm,
even if I send a contract off to somebody else, I always encourage them to, get their attorney to look at it, make sure they're comfortable with all the language in it. And in a business like this, you have to be very careful.
No doubt. But I mean, there's going to be people who are like, barely, paying the rent. How are they going to afford to get an attorney? Like, how can they, if they're sort of young and hungry, get to grips with the contract without that? Or do they have to just sort of go get the money from somewhere and actually find themselves an attorney?
If it were me, I know I would.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I was penniless, I wouldn't put my name on something, signing an agreement
Right.
without understanding exactly what's there.
Because I presume it also has to be an entertainment attorney or a media savvy attorney. It can't just be sort of your friend that does real estate law or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fascinating. So effectively, yes, I mean, that does sort of make you a little bit, it sounds less like a publishing house and more like the old Renaissance painter studio idea where you might, buy a painting that's after Raphael or might even say Raphael or Titian, but it came from the studio of that painter because he couldn't possibly paint all the commissions himself. So he'd have, teams and teams of young artists who would eventually, of course, make it and then go off and create their own studios.
Yeah.
Let's just quickly give everyone all the titles and the websites and social media that they need to find to get to, including your book talk stuff. And then if there's just any closing words you'd like to we'll do that. So how do people find you if they want to buy your books, if they want to work with you, if they wanted to approach you for co-authoring or something like how do people do this? And give us your title list as well so people can find you on Amazon.
Sure. So the easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. If you're interested in the co-authoring thing, there is a contact button on there with a little form. Just fill that out and send your information and I'll reach back out to you. The books can be found pretty much everywhere. I'm in bookstores all around the world, everywhere online. I've got a number of titles coming out over the next couple of months. We Don't Talk About Emma comes out in February, first week of February. I've got another book called The Writer that I wrote with James Patterson coming out in the beginning of March. And my next solo title comes out in May. It's called Something I Keep Upstairs, which is probably the scariest book I think I've ever written. It took me about 4 years to actually get that one done because I kept freaking myself out and had to put it aside and kind of come back to it. But I got it done. I'm glad that it's finished and it comes out in May. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join our website, newtrailslearning.com, to check out our online courses and live workshops in Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Athena. These evidence-based programs have helped children, veterans, and people dealing with trauma around the world. We also offer a horse training program and self-care program for riders on longridehome.com. These include easy-to-do online courses and tutorials that bring you and your horse joy. For an overview of all shows and programs, go to rupertisaacson.com. See you on the next show. And please remember to press subscribe and share.